Wake up with the morning light, mountain air, a chilling bite. Got my pack, I'm good to go, where the river currents flow.
We continue the exciting true-life Alaskan adventure story of Norman and Sylvia Wilkins. If you missed any earlier episodes, please be sure to go back and enjoy them. The Alaska Diaries is a narrated true story based on first-hand journal account from 1979 through the 80s and 90s, following one couple's journey to build a life in the Alaskan wilderness. Told in immersive, audiobook-style episodes, this series brings you into the mud, the cold, the danger, and the determination it takes to keep going. Subscribe and follow the journey if you enjoy true survival stories, wilderness adventure, and real-life grit. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. New episodes premiere weekly. The Alaska Diaries, 10,000 Days. Episode 10. Norman builds his trap cabin, running the dogs, and a visit to the lower 48. Part 1. Norman builds his trap cabin, October 1980. Getting materials in and choosing the site. We didn't just drive up and start building. Nothing out here ever works that way. Everything had to be flown in or packed by hand. Before the first log ever touched the ground, I was already cutting plywood sheets in half lengthwise so they could fit into a small plane. Every cut mattered. Every pound mattered more. A Super Cub came in low over Whole Lake, dropped its load, and banked away like it was leaving us in another world entirely. Sylvia stood beside the stacks as we staged materials. "You really think we're going to carry all this?" she asked, looking at the pile. "We're not going to," I said. "We already are." She gave me a look. "That's not comforting." "It's accurate," I said. We made multiple flights like that, staging everything at Whole Lake until the ground looked more like a supply dump than wilderness. From there, it stopped being aviation work. It became muscle. I packed load after load up a steep grade, over 100 feet of elevation, then across tundra and brush for more than a quarter mile. The stove alone nearly finished me. At one point, I set it down, caught my breath, and just stood there. Sylvia came up behind me with her pack still on. "You going to admit that one's heavy?" she asked. "I'm considering it," I said. She nodded. "That's progress." We both laughed, but neither of us dropped anything. Before any building started, we chose 2 locations. One for the cabin, one for a raised cache to keep food safe from animals. Sylvia walked the ground slowly, scanning it like she was reading something written there. "This spot?" she asked. I nodded. "High enough, dry enough, close enough to water." "And the bears?" she asked. "They don't get a vote," I said. She smiled slightly. "I like that policy." We built the cache first, 12 feet up off the tundra. I cut the poles. Sylvia helped lift and steady them while I lashed them into place. At one point, she stepped back, looked up at it, and said, "That thing looks like it could survive us." "That's the idea," I said. We stored supplies there, then threw together a tarp lean-to nearby and set up the stove. The first time we lit it, Sylvia held her hands near the heat and said, "I didn't realize how cold I was until now." "That's how it works out here," I told her. "You don't feel the cold until you stop fighting it." Only after that were we ready to build. The first step, the foundation and floor. The first real step was the foundation. There's nothing precise about building on tundra. You don't level so much as you negotiate. I cut and dragged in base logs and set them directly on the ground, choosing the flattest spot I could find. Sylvia knelt beside one of them, brushing snow off the bark. "So this is the beginning of a house," she said. "It's the outline of one," I said. She looked up at me. "Feels smaller than I expected." "Wait until we fill it in," I said. Next came the floor joists. I mortised 7 joists directly into the foundation logs. No shortcuts. Everything had to fit tight, or it wouldn't survive the winter. Sylvia handed me tools when I needed them, held the ends steady when I needed alignment, and once just said quietly, "You make this look like it has to be done a certain way." "It does," I said. "Or you just believe it does," she replied. I didn't answer that one right away. Once the joists were set, we packed in the plywood sheets and nailed down the floor. That floor changed everything. Up until then, we were working out of mud, snow, and uneven ground. Now there was something solid beneath us. Sylvia stepped onto it carefully at first, then more firmly. "It feels like cheating," she said. "It's not," I told her. "It's just the first part that feels like progress. Next step, the walls and structure." With the floor in place, I started on the walls. Each log was cut to about 6 feet, flattened on 2 sides, and peeled where it needed to be. We hauled them in 2 at a time using a small puka sled. Sylvia pulled the chest rope more than once, leaning back into it. At one point, she stopped and said, breathing hard, "You ever think you picked this job just to make sure nobody else would want it?" I looked at the log we were dragging. "That wasn't the intention." "That doesn't answer the question," she said. "It answers it honestly," I replied. She snorted. "That's your specialty." To stack the walls. Logs were laid one at a time. We spiked them together using long log spikes, driven in by hand with a 3-pound hammer. No drill, no power tools for assembly. Just steel, wood, and repetition. Sylvia handed me spikes as I worked. "You trust that's enough?" she asked once. "It has to be," I said. "That's not reassuring." "It's structural," I told her. We worked our way up. First one wall, then another. Then we cut openings for windows as we went. At one point, Sylvia stood framed in one of those openings and said, "This is starting to look like something people might actually live in." "We're people," I said. She smiled. "I keep forgetting that part." By the end, all walls were up, and I added top plates to tie everything together. Sylvia ran her hand along the top log. "It's taller than it feels from the outside," she said. "That's usually how it works," I said. Wrapping it up, roof, door, and finishing work. Once the walls were finished, I set the ridgepole and began installing rafters. As each rafter went up, I immediately laid plywood sheeting over it. Sylvia watched from below. "You're not giving yourself much room to breathe in this process," she said. "We'll breathe inside," I replied. After both sides of the roof were sheeted, I sealed it using aluminum press plates, salvage printing plates, and tar between each layer to keep out water. Sylvia looked at the roof once it was done and said, "That looks like it belongs on something industrial, not something people sleep under." "It's both," I said. Then came the finishing work. We built and hung the door, installed windows, moved the stove inside, built bunks, a table, and a small kitchen. Each step made the cabin feel less like construction and more like occupation. Finally, we chinked the walls from the inside, sealing every gap against the cold. We worked late into the nights by lantern light, hands stiff, breath visible in the air, even inside the cabin until the stove finally caught up. Sylvia pressed clay into a gap between logs and said quietly, "This feels like closing the world out." "It is," I said. "Or keeping someone in," she replied. "Same thing in winter," I said. And when it was done, we stood inside a solid cabin, built by hand, in the middle of nowhere. Sylvia looked around one last time and said, "I can't tell if this feels like shelter or commitment." I looked at the door, then back at the walls. "Out here," I said, "those are the same thing." Part 2. The first snow and running the dogs. November 1980 didn't arrive like a season that year. It arrived like a decision already made. On the first, I was still working on the dog sled. Sylvia came out once, hands tucked in her sleeves. "You're starting early this year," she said. I kept working for a moment before answering. "Winter doesn't care what we call early." She watched me for a while and said, "No," she said quietly, "it really doesn't. There's a strange shift that happens when you start building a sled. It stops being carpentry and becomes preparation for weather you haven't met yet, but already trust will be worse than you remember." By late afternoon, I was cutting grass hay for bedding. The dogs were circling closer now, watching every motion. They always know when their world is about to change. That evening, snow moved along the mountain line southwest of us. The sun broke through it just right, and the whole sky lit up like fire trapped inside the storm. Sylvia stood beside me without speaking for a long time. Finally, she said, "It almost looks alive." "It is," I said, "just not on our side." By the third and fourth, I wasn't really building anymore. I was assembling something that already existed in my head and refused to match reality without argument. Rain came in 1 hour, snow the next. The kind of weather that makes you rethink every decision you've made since summer. I called Jim from the shop, holding the receiver with one hand while trying to dry my sleeve with the other. "You're still on that sled?" he asked. "It's still on me," I said. He laughed. "That sounds about right." By the 5th, I had the mortise and tenon joints fitted, plain smooth, and bound with rawhide. The smell of wet wood and hide glue filled the shop. Sylvia came in carrying coffee. "You ever think about building something that doesn't involve freezing your hands off?" I looked down at the frame. "Sometimes I think about it," I said. Then I stopped thinking about it. She set the cup down. "That sounds healthy. It keeps things honest." The truck wouldn't start one morning. Of course it wouldn't. Dan Chappell dropped me at Billman's shop, and I spent the day cutting slats while listening to a radio that kept fading in and out like it couldn't decide whether we existed. Soon I was measuring dogs for harnesses. That's when the work stops being about tools and starts being about temperament. Some dogs fit the idea of pulling a sled. Others argue with it. Sylvia leaned on the door frame while I checked measurements. "You really think they're ready?" she asked. "They don't know enough to say no yet," I said. "That doesn't sound like a plan," she replied. "It's the beginning of one." That night there was a party at Tulsona Lake. People laughing, talking about corn being sold, land being rented, life moving in all directions at once. My son Paul called from Minnesota that same day. When I hung up, Sylvia asked, "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I said. "Just feels like everything's happening in two places at once." On the 9th, it hit minus 17 degrees. I wrote it down because it felt like something worth remembering, even though it wouldn't feel unusual for long. The dogs were starting to change. Fear was lead dog, but leadership is not just position, it's willingness. And she didn't always have it. Oscar and Max surprised me. Chrissy surprised me in the wrong direction. On the 15th, I finally hooked them up. "All right," I said, stepping back. "Let's see what you think this is." They surged forward immediately. Sylvia stood a few yards away. "That doesn't look controlled." "It isn't," I said. "That's comforting," she said dryly. The sled moved. Not cleanly, not smoothly, but it moved. That was enough for now. Trouble in the lines. By this time, I stopped calling it training and started calling it troubleshooting. Mac broke loose and tore harnesses. Fear refused commands she had accepted the day before. Chrissy tangled everything she touched. On November 21st, I tried a run that lasted maybe long enough to believe in and then collapsed immediately afterward. I stood there in the snow holding the line. Nothing was pulling forward anymore. "Just wait." Sylvia came down later. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm counting what's missing," I answered. "And it keeps changing." She nodded like she understood more than she said. That's usually the worst kind. By the 24th, fear had chewed through her harness again. I sat on the sled runners that evening and just stared at the yard. Charlie said, "Maybe she's not your lead dog." I answered without looking up, "Then I need to figure out what she is." Part 3. The cold that changes everything. Late November didn't arrive so much as it settled permanently. Everything froze. Water systems, engines, tools left in the wrong place. By December 8th, it was minus 30 degrees all day. Leather had to be repaired before it was even considered usable. Boots cracked at the seams. Every job had a second version of itself, waiting to be done again. Sylvia watched me stitching leather by lamplight. "You ever miss easy seasons?" she asked. "I don't think I've met one I'd recognize," I said. I got a small smile out of her. "That sounds like you." December 9th, minus 40 degrees training run. The dogs still went out. Not well, but they went. Mike called that evening. We talked briefly, not about much, just enough to hear another place still existed. By December 12th, I hitched them at minus 48 degrees. They stood there in the cold like they were made of it. Except Fear. She didn't move like a lead dog anymore. She moved like something trying to decide whether leadership was still worth the effort. Sylvia watched quietly. Finally, she said, "She might be done." I didn't answer right away, because I think I already knew she was right. Besides, now it was time to switch gears, as we were about to travel out to the lower 48, first to see my mother, and then on to Minneapolis to see our kids and their families along with several old friends. Part 4. The lower 48 and family. We left on December 13th. Minus 45 degrees, wind pushing snow across the road in thin sheets like the world was being erased in real time. The van slid through mountain passes carefully, like even the road was unsure of itself. Anchorage. Flight delays, conflicts on board, waiting in lines that didn't feel like part of the journey so much as interruptions to it. Seattle, Los Angeles, and then my mother waiting at the airport like nothing about distance had changed anything. She hugged us and said, "You look like you've been somewhere serious." Sylvia replied, "We have." That night, our luggage didn't arrive. Sylvia looked at me and said, "Well, at least Alaska didn't come with us." I said, "It never stays far behind." We stayed a few days, then on to the Midwest. Minnesota, warm rooms and familiar faces. Minneapolis felt unreal in the way only warmth can feel unreal after cold that deep. Nadia's home was full of light, conversation, movement that didn't require planning around frostbite. Sylvia stood in the entryway and said softly, "I forgot people live like this." I didn't answer right away. I was still adjusting to the idea that doors could close without warning you. Family came in waves. Beverly, Teresa's family, Paul and Ruth. Food, stories, laughter that didn't need to compete with weather. At one point, someone asked about Alaska again. I said, "It doesn't stop when you leave it. It just waits." Christmas Day came with a long table and gifts that felt almost too normal to hold. Shirts, books. Sylvia opened one and smiled. "This feels like another language." "I think it is," I said. By the end of December, we were moving between houses, talking business between meals, trying to keep track of land, loans, people, obligations. Life in two worlds doesn't split evenly. It overlaps. And in the overlap, you lose track of which one is supposed to feel like home. On December 30th, the record ends mid-thought again. Because that's how that season felt. Not finished. Just paused somewhere between places. Closing reflection, Norman. The dogs were still back there. The sled was still back there. And whatever fear had been, lead, burden, mistake, or something in between, was still waiting in a cold that didn't care about decisions made in warm rooms. Winter doesn't end. It just waits for you to come back to it. This concludes our episode. If you are enjoying the story and would like the books this story is based on, go to 10,000daysinalaska.com for more info. A new episode will air next Saturday at 7 a.m. Alaska time. And for all you Midwesterners watching and listening, that means 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time.